My name is Samantha Mitchell, and I'm 28 years old. I was preparing dinner in our kitchen when I heard my dad's voice drifting from the living room. He was on the phone, thinking I couldn't hear him. I know, Linda. She's really become a burden. 3 years I've had to put up with this. This house is worth almost $1 million. Once she moves out, I'll sell it immediately. The plate I was holding slipped from my hands and shattered on the floor. My dad had no idea I'd heard every single word. Before we dive into what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button if you're ready for a story about family betrayal that'll shock you, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life drama stories. Trust me, you won't believe how this ends, so stick around until the very last part. Now, let me tell you exactly what I did when I discovered my own father's devastating plan. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst right out of my chest. The broken ceramic pieces at my feet seemed to mirror how I felt inside, completely shattered. I held my breath and strained to hear more of my father's conversation, praying I'd somehow misunderstood what I'd just heard. She thinks she's taking care of me, but it's just her way of controlling everything, my dad continued, his voice carrying that tone he used when he thought he was being reasonable. I want my freedom back, Linda. I want to marry you and start fresh. The woman's voice on the other end of the line was harder to make out, but I caught enough words to make my blood run cold. She was encouraging him, telling him he deserved happiness, and suggesting ways to make me leave voluntarily. That's when it hit me like a freight train. Linda Crawford. I knew exactly who this woman was. She was supposedly just a friend from his diabetes support group, someone I'd welcomed into our home countless times over the past year. Linda, with her warm smile and homemade cookies, who always asked such detailed questions about our finances and living situation. Linda, who seemed to show up at the most convenient times when I was stressed or exhausted from work. My mind raced back through months of interactions I'd had with this woman. She'd been so friendly, so concerned about my dad's well-being. She'd bring over casseroles when she knew I was working late, always making a point to mention how hard it must be for a young woman like me to sacrifice so much. At the time, I'd thought she was being supportive. Now I realized she'd been gathering intelligence. Linda's going to help me figure out how to put more pressure on Sam, my dad was saying now, and I had to grip the doorframe to keep from falling. She thinks if we make things more difficult around here, Sam will decide it's too much work and move out on her own. The casual way he said it, like he was discussing the weather, made me feel sick to my stomach. The conversation continued for another few minutes, with them discussing tactics and timelines like they were planning a business strategy. When I finally heard my dad saying goodbye and preparing to hang up, I quickly swept up the broken plate and tried to compose myself. By the time he walked into the kitchen, I was standing at the sink with my back to him, washing dishes with shaking hands. Hey sweetheart, everything okay in here? I thought I heard something crash. His voice was full of fake concern, and I wanted to scream. Instead, I turned around and gave him what I hoped was a normal smile. Just dropped a plate, Dad. No big deal. I watched his face carefully, looking for any sign of guilt or deception, but he just nodded and patted my shoulder in that paternal way he'd done since I was little. You've been working so hard lately, honey. Maybe you need to take a break. The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. Here he was, pretending to care about my well-being while actively plotting to destroy my life. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction I'd had with both my dad and Linda over the past 3 years. Since Mom died, I'd moved back home to help take care of him. His diabetes had been getting worse, and I genuinely believed he needed me. I'd given up my apartment, turned down job opportunities in other cities, and reorganized my entire life around making sure he was okay. Now I was seeing everything through a completely different lens. Had any of it been real? Had he ever actually needed my help, or had this all been some elaborate manipulation? I thought about all the times Linda had complimented me on being such a devoted daughter, all the times she'd made subtle comments about how I deserved to have my own life. I'd thought she was being kind and understanding. Instead, she'd been planting seeds of doubt and resentment. The worst part was realizing how alone I really was. My dad, the one person I'd trusted completely after losing my mom, had been lying to my face for who knows how long. And I had no idea how deep this conspiracy went or what they were planning to do next. The next morning, I went through the motions of our usual routine, making breakfast and helping my dad organize his medications, but everything felt different now. I watched him carefully, looking for signs I'd missed before. He seemed lighter somehow, humming under his breath as he read his phone messages. Several times throughout breakfast, his phone buzzed with text notifications, and I caught glimpses of his secret smile as he read them. This new awareness made me start questioning everything I thought I knew about the past 3 years. I remembered how quickly my dad had joined that diabetes support group after Mom's funeral. At the time, I'd encouraged it, thinking he needed social connection and professional guidance to cope with both his grief and his medical condition. Now I wondered if he'd had ulterior motives from the beginning. I started thinking about Linda's introduction into our lives. It had been about 6 months after Mom died when Dad first mentioned this wonderful new friend he'd met in group therapy. He described her as a retired nurse who really understood the challenges of managing diabetes. She'd started calling the house occasionally to check on him, and eventually, those calls turned into visits. Looking back now, I realized Linda had always been strategic about when she showed up. She'd arrive during my lunch breaks when I was home from work, or on weekends when I was doing housework. She'd bring food that catered perfectly to my dad's dietary restrictions while somehow always including ingredients I couldn't eat due to my allergies. At the time, I'd chalked it up to coincidence and poor memory on her part. Linda had also shown an unusual interest in our family's financial situation. She'd ask innocent-sounding questions about the mortgage, about how we were managing expenses, about whether I found it difficult to support 2 people on my salary. She'd frame these inquiries as concern for our well-being, worried that I was overextending myself financially. I'd actually appreciated what I thought was her genuine care for our family's stability. But now I remembered other things that hadn't made sense at the time. Linda had asked about my mom's will and life insurance policies, claiming she was curious because her own late husband had left such a complicated financial mess. She'd wanted to know about the house deed and whether my name was on any of the paperwork. She'd even suggested, more than once, that I should make sure my dad had updated his own will after my mother's death. That evening, my dad announced he was going to his regular support group meeting. This was something that happened twice a week, and I'd never questioned it before. But tonight, instead of staying home and catching up on work like I usually did, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I followed him. I waited until he'd been gone for 10 minutes, then got in my car and drove to the community center where the meetings were supposedly held. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the building was dark. There was no diabetes support group meeting that night, and according to the schedule posted by the entrance, there never had been meetings on Tuesday evenings. My hands were shaking as I drove around the neighborhood, not sure what I was looking for but knowing I needed to find my dad. After about 20 minutes of searching, I found his car parked in the driveway of a modest ranch house about 3 miles away. Through the living room window, I could see 2 figures sitting close together on a couch. Even from a distance, I could tell they were embracing. I sat in my car across the street, feeling like my world was crumbling around me. My dad and Linda weren't just conspiring against me, they were having a full-blown romantic relationship. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening for months, while I thought he was getting medical and emotional support, he'd actually been here with her, planning my downfall. I drove home before he returned, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd discovered. When my dad came through the front door an hour later, he launched into his usual post-meeting routine, telling me about the other group members and the topics they discussed. Every word was a lie, delivered with such casual confidence that I wondered how many other things he'd been lying about. "How was work today, sweetheart?" he asked, settling into his recliner with the evening news. "You seemed a little distracted this morning." Even his concern for my well-being was probably fake, just another layer of the performance he'd been putting on for years. I mumbled something about a difficult client and escaped to my room, where I finally allowed myself to cry. The man I'd sacrificed everything for, the father I'd loved and trusted unconditionally, had been playing an elaborate long game to get rid of me. And I had no idea how much time I had left before their plan kicked into high gear. The following week, Linda's visits to our house became noticeably more frequent. She'd show up unannounced with groceries or baked goods, always with some excuse about being in the neighborhood or having made too much food. But now that I knew what to look for, I could see the calculation behind every gesture. On Wednesday afternoon, I was working from home when Linda arrived with a tray of coffee and pastries. "I thought you and your dad might enjoy a little afternoon treat," she said, beaming at me with that warm smile I'd once found comforting. She set the tray down on the coffee table right next to my laptop, where I was finishing up a presentation that was due to my boss by 5 o'clock. "Oh, that's so thoughtful of you, Linda," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral while internally screaming. I watched as she fussed around the living room, straightening throw pillows and commenting on how hard I'd been working lately. "You know, dear, you really should take better care of yourself," she said, reaching across me to adjust the curtains. As she did, her elbow knocked over one of the coffee cups, sending hot liquid cascading directly onto my keyboard. The laptop screen flickered once and went black. "Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry." Linda's hands flew to her mouth in apparent horror, but I swear I saw a flash of satisfaction in her eyes. "You must be so stressed that you didn't notice how close that cup was to your computer. These accidents happen when we're overworked." I stared at the dark screen, 3 hours of work vanishing before my eyes. The presentation contained research I'd spent weeks compiling, and I had exactly 4 hours to recreate it from scratch. My dad appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, and immediately rushed to comfort Linda, who was now making a show of being distraught over the accident. "Don't blame Linda, Sam," he said firmly. "She was just trying to be nice. These things happen when you're not paying attention." His automatic defense of her, combined with the subtle implication that I was at fault, made my stomach clench with anger and betrayal. I spent the rest of that day and most of the night recreating my presentation, surviving on coffee and determination. When I finally submitted it at 4:58 a.m., 2 minutes before the deadline, I was exhausted and my work was noticeably less polished than usual. My boss called me into her office the next day to express concern about the quality and to suggest I might need to improve my time management skills. But Linda wasn't finished with her campaign to make my life difficult. Over the next 2 weeks, she established a pattern of arriving at our house precisely during the times I needed quiet to decompress from work. She'd turn on the television at full volume, claiming my dad needed cheery background noise to keep his spirits up. When I politely asked her to lower the volume, she'd look hurt and say something like, "Your poor father needs some joy in his life, dear. Surely you don't want to deny him that." She began bringing elaborate meals that required significant cleanup, always timing her cooking projects for when I had planned to relax or catch up on personal tasks. If I didn't immediately offer to help with the dishes, she'd make passive-aggressive comments about how difficult it must be for my dad to manage household chores with his condition. If I did help, she'd criticize my technique and redo whatever I'd just finished cleaning. The meals themselves were another source of constant irritation. Linda seemed to have an encyclopedic knowledge of my food allergies and sensitivities, which my dad had apparently shared with her in great detail. She'd prepare elaborate spreads featuring every ingredient that made me sick, then express surprise and concern when I couldn't eat anything she'd made. "Oh, you can't have shellfish? But I made this beautiful crab casserole especially for dinner tonight." "Well, I suppose you'll have to make something for yourself. We can't expect your father to go hungry just because you have dietary restrictions." The way she said it made me sound like I was being deliberately difficult and selfish. My dad's response to these situations was always the same. He'd take Linda's side, telling me I was being ungrateful and oversensitive. "Linda has such a generous heart," he'd say after she left. "I don't understand why you can't just appreciate what she's trying to do for us." The irony of him lecturing me about appreciation, when I'd been sacrificing my own needs for his well-being for 3 years, was almost unbearable. During this time, I noticed my bank account balance dropping faster than usual. There were unexpected expenses cropping up constantly, light bulbs that needed replacing after mysteriously burning out, groceries that spoiled unusually quickly and needed to be replaced, small household items that went missing and had to be purchased again. None of these things were major expenses individually, but together they were creating a steady financial drain that I couldn't quite explain. Linda had also started making suggestions about how I could contribute more meaningfully to the household budget. She'd mention expensive medical equipment that might help my dad's condition, or home modifications that would make his life easier. When I explained that these items weren't in my budget, she'd look disappointed and make comments about how some children spare no expense for their parents' comfort. I was starting to feel like a prisoner in my own home, constantly walking on eggshells and second-guessing every interaction. The stress was affecting my work performance and my physical health. I was losing weight from lack of appetite and losing sleep from constant anxiety. But I still had no concrete proof of what Linda and my dad were planning, just a growing sense of dread about what might be coming next. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, my brother David showed up at our front door on a Sunday afternoon in early October. I hadn't seen him in almost 2 years, not since the Christmas after Mom's funeral when we'd had a terrible fight about his complete absence during her illness and his failure to help with any of the funeral arrangements. David looked good, dressed in an expensive suit and driving a new BMW that he'd parked conspicuously in our driveway. At 32, he'd always been the golden child, the successful one who'd moved to Chicago for his finance job and rarely looked back. Seeing him standing on our doorstep with a bouquet of flowers and a concerned expression immediately put me on guard. "Sam. You look so thin. Are you taking care of yourself?" His opening words, delivered with apparent brotherly concern, hit me like a slap. After 2 years of complete silence, his first comment was about my appearance. But I was so desperate for family support that I found myself hoping maybe he'd changed, maybe he was finally ready to help shoulder some of the responsibility for our dad's care. "David, what are you doing here?" I asked, stepping aside to let him in. Our dad had been napping in his chair, but he woke up the moment he heard David's voice. The reunion between father and son was warm and emotional, full of backslapping and promises that they wouldn't let so much time pass without seeing each other again. "I've been thinking a lot about family lately," David explained as we sat down in the living room. "I realize I haven't been pulling my weight when it comes to Dad's care. I want to make up for that." He turned to look at me with what appeared to be genuine remorse. "Sam, I can't imagine how difficult this has been for you. You've given up so much to be here." For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe David had finally matured enough to understand what I'd been going through. Maybe I was about to have an ally in dealing with Linda and whatever scheme she was cooking up with our father. I found myself opening up to him, telling him about the stress I'd been under and the strange changes I'd noticed in Dad's behavior lately. "Linda seems to be around a lot more these days," I said carefully, not wanting to sound paranoid but needing to voice my concerns to someone who might understand. "Sometimes I feel like there's something going on that I don't fully understand." David nodded thoughtfully, asking careful questions about Linda's visits and my dad's routine. He seemed genuinely interested in my perspective, taking mental notes about the financial pressures I'd been experiencing and the way Linda always seemed to undermine my efforts to maintain boundaries in the household. "It sounds like you're really overwhelmed, sis," he said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "Maybe it's time we had a family meeting about how to better support both you and Dad going forward." I felt tears of relief welling up in my eyes. Finally, someone was taking my concerns seriously. That evening, after Linda had come and gone from one of her usual dinner visits, I was getting ready for bed when I heard voices coming from Dad's study. The door was closed, but I could make out my dad's voice and David's, speaking in low, serious tones. Thinking they might be discussing care arrangements or ways to help me with the household responsibilities, I moved closer to listen. What I heard instead made my blood run cold. "Dad, I'm telling you, Sam is not handling this situation well," David was saying. "She seems paranoid and unstable. She's been making these strange accusations about Linda, who's obviously just trying to help. I'm genuinely worried about her mental state." "Your sister has been acting differently lately," my dad replied. "She's become more difficult to deal with, more confrontational." She argues with Linda constantly and seems resentful of any help we receive. Look, Dad, I think it's time we face facts here. Sam is struggling with some serious psychological issues. She's become controlling and possessive, and it's not healthy for anyone, especially not for you. David's voice carried the authority of his professional success, making his amateur psychological assessment sound somehow credible. Maybe we need to think about other living arrangements, my dad said slowly. This house is getting to be too much work anyway, and Sam clearly can't handle the pressure of managing everything. I've been thinking the same thing, David replied. What if we sold this place and found you something smaller and more manageable? Sam would be forced to become more independent, which honestly might be the best thing for her in the long run. I pressed my back against the wall, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. My own brother, who I'd just poured my heart out to, was collaborating with our father to make me sound mentally unstable. Every concern I'd shared with him in confidence was being twisted and used as evidence of my supposed psychological problems. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with David and my dad discussing my behavioral issues and the best strategies for helping me transition to independence. They talked about me like I was a troubled teenager rather than a grown woman who'd been successfully managing a career and a household for years. When I finally crept back to my room, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. Not only had my father been plotting against me with his girlfriend, but my own brother had willingly joined their conspiracy after less than 24 hours in our house. The two people who should have been my strongest allies were instead working together to destroy my stability and my reputation. The next morning, David made a show of being the concerned brother, asking me about my work stress and suggesting I might benefit from talking to a counselor. There's no shame in getting professional help when you're dealing with a lot of pressure, he said over breakfast, his voice full of fake compassion. I can give you the name of someone really good in the area. I realized then that every word of sympathy, every gesture of brotherly concern, had been part of a calculated performance designed to gather ammunition for their campaign against me. David hadn't come home to help, he'd come home to provide legitimacy for whatever plan they were hatching. And I still had no idea how much time I had left before they put that plan into action. Over the next 3 weeks, Linda and David's psychological warfare campaign against me became significantly more sophisticated and relentless. What had started as small irritations and isolated incidents evolved into a coordinated effort to make me appear unstable and incompetent to manage my own life, let alone assist with my father's care. Linda began making frequent comments about my memory and organizational skills, always framed as loving concern but designed to plant seeds of doubt about my mental capacity. Sam, dear, you left the front door unlocked again yesterday, she'd say in front of my father, even though I was certain I'd locked it. And I noticed you forgot to turn off the kitchen faucet this morning. The water was running for hours. These supposed memory lapses were news to me, but when I protested that I hadn't made these mistakes, Linda would exchange meaningful glances with my father and suggest that stress could affect people in unexpected ways. Sometimes we don't realize we're struggling until someone points it out, she'd say gently. There's no shame in admitting when we need help. David, meanwhile, had extended his visit indefinitely, claiming he was taking some overdue vacation time to spend with family. In reality, he was documenting every interaction I had with him and our father, building what appeared to be a case file of my concerning behaviors. He'd ask me detailed questions about my work schedule, my financial situation, and my social life, then take notes on his phone immediately afterward. I'm just trying to understand how we can better support you, he'd explain when I questioned his constant note-taking. But I noticed he was particularly interested in any signs that I was struggling financially or socially, asking repeatedly about my dating life and whether I had friends I could rely on for emotional support. The sabotage became more creative and destructive as October progressed. I'd wake up in the morning to find that food in our refrigerator had spoiled overnight, despite being fresh when I'd put it away the evening before. The thermostat would be set to extremes that made the house uncomfortable and drove up our utility bills. Light bulbs would burn out with suspicious frequency, always in areas where I spent the most time working or relaxing. When I mentioned these strange occurrences to my father, he'd suggest that I was probably just not noticing things because I was distracted by work stress. Maybe you should take some time off, he'd say. You're clearly not yourself lately." Linda would nod in agreement, adding that she'd noticed similar signs of distraction and forgetfulness in other people who were struggling with burnout. The most devastating incident happened on a Thursday evening when I was preparing for an important presentation the next day. I'd left my laptop charging in the living room while I took a shower, and when I returned, I discovered that someone had spilled water on it. Not just a few drops, but enough to completely destroy the hard drive and 3 months' worth of work that I hadn't backed up. "Oh no, sweetheart," my father exclaimed when he saw my waterlogged computer. "You must have left that glass of water too close to your laptop again. I've warned you about being more careful with your electronics." Again, there was this implication that I'd caused the problem through my own carelessness, even though I had no memory of putting any water near my computer. Linda, who had been visiting that evening, was quick to offer sympathy and advice. "This is exactly the kind of thing that happens when we're overwhelmed," she said, putting a comforting arm around my shoulders. "Maybe this is a sign that you need to slow down and reevaluate your priorities." David nodded in agreement, pulling out his phone to make another note. "Dad, this is exactly what I was talking about," he said. "Sam's been making these kinds of careless mistakes more and more frequently. It's not normal for someone her age to be so absent-minded." I was forced to spend the entire night recreating my presentation from memory and scattered backup files, working until 6 in the morning to meet my deadline. When I presented the material to my boss and clients the next day, I was exhausted and unprepared, and it showed. The meeting didn't go well, and I could see my professional reputation starting to suffer from the cumulative effect of these accidents. Meanwhile, my father's behavior became increasingly strange in ways that seemed designed to make me look like an unreliable caregiver. He'd forget to take his medication when I was out of the house, then claim I hadn't reminded him properly when Linda or David found him in distress. He'd leave appliances running or doors open, then act confused and worried when I pointed out the potential safety hazards. "I don't remember doing that," he'd say, looking genuinely bewildered. "Sam, are you sure you didn't leave the stove on? I've been sitting in my chair all afternoon." These incidents always seemed to happen when Linda or David were around to witness my negligent caregiving. The financial pressure intensified as well. My father began mentioning expensive medical equipment and home modifications that he claimed his doctor had recommended. When I researched these recommendations, I couldn't find any evidence that his physician had suggested anything of the sort, but my father insisted he needed these items for his health and safety. "Dr. Peterson says I really should have that glucose monitoring system," he'd say. "It's only $1,500, and it could prevent a medical emergency." When I explained that I couldn't afford such a large unexpected expense, he'd look hurt and disappointed, as if I was prioritizing my own financial comfort over his well-being. Linda began suggesting that I might need professional help managing the household finances, since I seemed to be struggling to budget for my father's medical needs. She offered to introduce me to a financial advisor who could help me get my priorities straight and find ways to better support my father's care requirements. David enthusiastically endorsed this idea, pointing out that many successful people relied on professional guidance to manage their money effectively. "There's no shame in admitting that you're in over your head financially," he said. "The sooner you get help, the sooner we can make sure Dad gets the care he needs." I realized they were building a comprehensive case that I was incompetent in multiple areas of my life: professional, personal, financial, and medical. Every mistake I made, whether real or manufactured, was being documented and interpreted as evidence of deeper psychological problems. They were creating a narrative that would justify removing me from any decision-making role in my father's life, and potentially removing me from the house entirely. But I still didn't know exactly what their endgame was or how much time I had left before they made their move. All I knew was that the walls were closing in around me, and I was running out of allies and options. On the evening of November 15th, I came home early from work with a splitting headache, planning to rest before tackling a project that was due the next morning. As I approached the front door, I could hear voices coming from the living room. What I heard through the slightly open window made me freeze in my tracks. "The plan is working perfectly," Linda was saying, her voice carrying a satisfied tone I'd never heard before. "Sam is exhausted and making mistakes constantly. She's starting to crack under the pressure." I have to admit, I was worried about whether this would actually work, David replied. But you were right about the psychological approach being more effective than anything obvious. People always underestimate the power of sustained, subtle manipulation, Linda continued. A few broken appliances, some misplaced items, constant criticism disguised as concern. It's much more effective than outright confrontation, and it leaves the target questioning their own perception of reality. I crouched down below the window, my heart hammering as I listened to them discuss me like I was some kind of laboratory experiment. My father's voice joined the conversation, and what he said next made my blood turn to ice. I keep feeling guilty about this, though, he said. She is still my daughter, and she has been taking care of me for 3 years. Robert, we've been over this, Linda's voice turned sharp and impatient. Do you love me, or do you love her? Because you can't have both. We need this house to start our new life together, and we need her gone to make that happen. Linda's right, Dad, David chimed in. Sam is holding you back from having the relationship and the freedom you deserve. Besides, this is ultimately good for her too. She needs to learn to be independent instead of using your care as an excuse to avoid building her own life. The beauty of our approach, Linda continued, is that when we finally make our move, everyone will think we're being generous and patient. Sam will look like the problem child who couldn't handle responsibility, and will look like the loving family members who tried everything to help her. Speaking of making our move, David said, I think it's time we move to the next phase. I've prepared the power of attorney documents that will transfer Dad's financial and property management to me, since Sam has proven she's not competent to handle these responsibilities. And I've been documenting her behavioral issues from a medical perspective, Linda added. I still have my nursing credentials, so my assessment of her psychological state will carry weight if anyone questions our decisions. What exactly are you documenting? My father asked, and I could hear genuine curiosity in his voice. Memory problems, poor judgment, financial irresponsibility, inability to maintain household safety standards. Linda rattled off the list like she was reading from a medical chart. Plus signs of depression and anxiety that make her unsuitable as a primary caregiver. I can provide a professional opinion that she needs supervised living arrangements, at least temporarily. Once I have power of attorney, David explained, I can make the argument that this house is too much for Dad to manage and that the proceeds from selling it should go toward his care and medical needs. Sam will get a small settlement, enough to rent a modest apartment, but the bulk of the money will go toward Dad's future security. How small a settlement are we talking about? My father asked. I'm thinking maybe $50,000, David replied casually, as if he wasn't discussing stealing nearly $1 million from his own sister. Enough for her to get started somewhere else, but not enough to make her financially independent. She needs to learn to support herself. And of course, Linda added with a laugh that made my skin crawl, once Sam is out of the picture, Robert and I can get married and use the remaining funds to buy a nice little place in Florida. We've been looking at some lovely retirement communities near Tampa. The casual way they discussed dismantling my life and stealing my inheritance was breathtaking in its cruelty. These weren't people who had reluctantly concluded I was a burden, they were predators who had identified an opportunity and systematically worked to exploit it. When do we implement this plan? My father asked, and I held my breath waiting for the answer. I think we should move forward next week, David said. I've already scheduled an appointment with Dad's lawyer for Thursday morning. Once the power of attorney is signed, we can move quickly on the house sale. I have a real estate contact who says he can get us a cash offer within a week if we price it right. What about Sam? My father asked. How do we explain this to her? We present it as a loving intervention, Linda explained. We tell her that we're all worried about her mental health and that we think some time away from caregiving responsibilities will help her recover. We frame the house sale as a necessary step to ensure proper care for Robert, and we emphasize that we're providing her with enough money to get back on her feet. And if she fights it? David asked. She won't have legal standing to fight it if Dad has already signed the power of attorney, Linda replied confidently. Besides, by then we'll have documented so many incidents of her instability that any legal challenge she makes will just reinforce our position that she's not competent to manage her own affairs, let alone anyone else's. I realized I was listening to the final planning session for my complete destruction. In less than a week, these three people were going to strip away my home, my financial security, and my reputation, all while congratulating themselves for their compassion and generosity. But this time, I was ready for them. I'd been recording the entire conversation on my phone, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I had concrete evidence of their conspiracy. More importantly, I finally understood the full scope of their plan, which meant I could start developing a strategy to fight back. As quietly as I could, I backed away from the window and walked to my car. I needed time to think and plan before I went back into that house and pretended everything was normal. Because if they thought they could manipulate me into giving up without a fight, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. That night, I drove around for hours, my mind racing as I processed everything I'd heard and started formulating a plan of my own. By the time I finally returned home, David and Linda had left, and my father was already asleep. I crept into my room and immediately began researching everything I could find about Linda Crawford. What I discovered in the first hour of digging made my blood run cold. Linda hadn't just been targeting my father, she had a history of precisely this kind of manipulation and fraud. A Google search of her name combined with terms like elder fraud and financial exploitation led me to a news article from 2 years earlier about a case in Phoenix, Arizona. The article described how Linda had befriended a recently widowed man named Harold Torres, gradually isolated him from his family, and convinced him to sign over power of attorney to her adult son. By the time Harold's daughter discovered what was happening, Linda and her accomplice had stolen nearly $400,000 from Harold's retirement savings and sold his house for cash. The case had gone to trial, but Linda had avoided conviction due to lack of concrete evidence. Harold's daughter, Mrs. Helen Torres, had fought for 2 years to recover her father's assets, with limited success. The article included a quote from Mrs. Torres warning other families to be aware of Linda's tactics and describing her as a master manipulator who targets vulnerable seniors and their devoted caregivers. My hands were shaking as I found Helen Torres's contact information and called her at 7 o'clock the next morning. When she answered, I introduced myself and explained why I was calling. "Oh honey," Mrs. Torres said immediately, "I was wondering when this day would come. I've been tracking Linda Crawford ever since she destroyed my father's life. She moves around the country every few years, always targeting the same type of victim. Your situation sounds exactly like what happened to us." Mrs. Torres spent an hour on the phone with me, describing Linda's methods in detail and explaining how the scam typically worked. She identifies elderly men who have recently lost their wives and have adult children who are acting as caregivers, Helen explained. Then she infiltrates their support systems and systematically turns the father against the child, usually with the help of a male accomplice who poses as a concerned family member. The accomplice is always someone who has a legitimate claim to inheritance but wants more than their fair share, she continued. In our case, it was my cousin who helped Linda manipulate my father. The goal is always to get power of attorney transferred to someone who will sell the victim's assets and split the proceeds with Linda. Helen gave me the contact information for Elena Rodriguez, a lawyer who specialized in elder fraud and family exploitation cases. "Elena helped me recover some of my father's money," she said. "More importantly, she knows exactly how to build a legal case against people like Linda. You need to call her today." I reached Elena Rodriguez's office that afternoon and scheduled an emergency consultation for the same evening. When I played her the recording I'd made of Linda, David, and my father's conversation, her expression became grim and focused. "This is textbook elder fraud," Elena said, "but it's also conspiracy to commit theft and possibly extortion. The good news is that you have clear evidence of their intent before they've actually committed the crimes. That gives us a significant advantage." Elena explained that we needed to document everything carefully and build a comprehensive case before confronting the conspirators. If we move too quickly, they'll just deny everything and accelerate their timeline, she warned. "But if we're strategic about this, we can not only protect you and your father but also ensure that Linda faces serious legal consequences." She gave me specific instructions for gathering additional evidence. I was to install hidden recording devices in the common areas of the house, document any financial irregularities or suspicious activities, and maintain detailed records of every interaction with Linda and David. Most importantly, I was to act completely normal until we had everything we needed to make our case. The next few days were the most difficult of my life. I had to sit across the breakfast table from my father and make casual conversation while knowing he was planning to steal my inheritance. I had to smile and nod when Linda made her fake concerned comments about my well-being, knowing she was documenting everything to use against me later. David continued his performance as the worried brother, even going so far as to suggest family counseling to help us all communicate better during this difficult time. The irony of him recommending therapy while actively plotting to gaslight me into believing I was mentally unstable was almost unbearable. But I kept Elena's words in mind and focused on gathering evidence. I recorded several more conversations between the three conspirators, each one providing additional details about their timeline and methods. I photographed the documents David had brought with him, including the power of attorney papers and contact information for his real estate friend, who would help them sell the house quickly. Most importantly, I started reaching out to my father's actual medical team to verify the claims Linda and David had been making about his care needs. When I spoke to his real doctor, I learned that none of the expensive equipment they'd been pressuring me to purchase had ever been recommended. In fact, Dr. Peterson was surprised to hear that my father was having difficulty managing his condition, since his last several checkups had shown excellent blood sugar control. "Your father's diabetes is very well managed," Dr. Peterson told me during a phone consultation I'd requested. "I've actually been impressed by how consistent his care has been. Someone has been doing an excellent job monitoring his diet and medication schedule." I also contacted my father's bank to inquire about any unusual account activity. What I discovered was alarming. Over the past 6 months, there had been several large cash withdrawals that I knew nothing about. When I asked my father about them, he claimed he'd needed the money for medical expenses, but when I asked for receipts, he became defensive and changed the subject. By the end of the week, Elena and I had assembled a comprehensive case file documenting the conspiracy against me. We had audio recordings, financial evidence, medical records that contradicted Linda's claims, and testimony from Helen Torres about Linda's history of similar crimes. "We're ready to move," Elena told me on Wednesday evening. "Tomorrow morning, when David takes your father to sign those power of attorney documents, we'll be there with the police. Linda Crawford's crime spree is finally coming to an end." As I went to bed that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. In less than 24 hours, the people who had been systematically trying to destroy my life would finally face consequences for their actions. And my father would learn exactly what kind of people he'd chosen to trust over his own daughter. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold, perfectly matching my mood as I prepared for what I knew would be the most important day of my life. I got up early and went through my usual routine, making breakfast for my father and helping him organize his medications, all while knowing it would probably be the last time I'd ever do these things for him. David had announced the night before that he was taking our father to handle some important paperwork that morning, claiming it was related to updating his medical directives and insurance beneficiaries. My father had seemed nervous about the appointment, which I now understood was because he knew exactly what documents he was planning to sign and what those signatures would mean for my future. "Are you sure you don't want me to come with you?" I asked innocently as they prepared to leave. "I usually handle Dad's medical appointments." "That's exactly the problem," David replied smoothly. "Dad needs to start taking more control over his own affairs instead of relying on you for everything. This is part of helping him become more independent." The irony of him talking about independence while planning to take over our father's financial autonomy was staggering. Linda arrived just as they were getting ready to leave, ostensibly to keep me company while the men handled business. She brought a box of pastries and a concerned expression, ready to comfort me when I inevitably discovered that my role in the family had been dramatically reduced. "Sam, honey, I hope you understand that everything happening today is for the best," she said as we watched my father and David drive away. "Your father loves you, but he's worried about how much pressure you've been under. Sometimes families have to make difficult decisions." I nodded and made appropriate responses while internally counting down the minutes until Elena and the police would spring our trap. According to our plan, they would arrive at the lawyer's office just as my father was about to sign the power of attorney documents, armed with evidence of the conspiracy and prepared to arrest Linda and David on charges of elder fraud and attempted theft. At 10:30, exactly when I knew my father and David would be sitting in the lawyer's office, my phone rang. It was Elena. "We got them," she said simply. "The police interrupted the signing ceremony and placed Linda and David under arrest. Your father is shaken but unharmed, and he's asking to speak with you." 20 minutes later, I walked into the lawyer's office to find my father sitting alone at the conference table, looking older and more confused than I'd ever seen him. The power of attorney documents were spread out in front of him, unsigned, while Elena spoke quietly with the office staff about what had just transpired. "Sam," my father said when he saw me, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand what's happening. They're saying Linda and David were trying to steal from us." I sat down across from him and pulled out my phone, playing back portions of the recordings I'd made of their planning sessions. As he listened to Linda describing him as a meal ticket and David casually discussing stealing $900,000 from his own sister, my father's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally, shame. "They were using me," he said when the recording finished. "All this time, I thought Linda cared about me, and David was trying to help the family. But they were just using me to get to our money." "Dad," I said quietly, "they were using both of us. Everything that's been happening these past few months, all the pressure and the stress and the accusations about my competence, it was all part of their plan to make you think I was the problem." Elena joined us at the table and explained the legal situation. Linda had been charged with attempted elder fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, and several counts related to her previous crimes in Arizona. David faced charges of conspiracy to commit theft and fraud, and he would likely lose his financial licenses as a result of his arrest. "The good news," Elena continued, "is that none of their plan was actually implemented. Your father didn't sign any documents, no money was transferred, and the house is still entirely in your name as the sole heir according to your mother's will and your father's unchanged estate plan." My father looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "Sam, can you ever forgive me? I was so stupid, so easily manipulated. I believed them when they said you were trying to control my life, when the truth was that you've been sacrificing everything to take care of me." For a moment, I considered telling him that everything could go back to the way it was before, that we could rebuild our relationship and continue living together as if none of this had happened. But as I looked at this man who had been willing to destroy my life for a woman he'd known for less than 2 years, I realized that some betrayals cut too deep to ever fully heal. "Dad," I said finally, "I understand that Linda and David manipulated you, but you made choices too. You chose to believe I was a burden instead of a daughter who loved you. You chose to plan behind my back instead of talking to me directly. You chose to trust strangers over someone who had been devoted to your care for 3 years. I know," he whispered. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness." "You're right," I replied. "You don't." Elena had prepared all the necessary paperwork for me to take immediate and complete control of the family's assets. Since I was already the legal heir and my father's financial decision-making had been called into question due to his involvement with known fraudsters, the court had granted me emergency authority to protect the estate. Within a week, I had sold our family home to Trevor Hughes, the investor neighbor who had been quietly watching the situation unfold and had made a cash offer of $980,000. The sale was completed quickly and without complications, giving me the freedom to start over wherever I chose. Linda was sentenced to 5 years in prison after pleading guilty to multiple counts of fraud. David received 3 years of probation and was ordered to pay restitution, though his career in finance was effectively over. My father was left to deal with the consequences of his choices, facing both legal scrutiny and social shame as the details of the case became public. 6 months after everything fell apart, I was sitting in my new apartment in downtown Portland, looking out at the city skyline and reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed. The high-rise condo I'd purchased with part of the proceeds from selling our family home was everything I'd never known I wanted: modern, private, and completely mine. I'd used another portion of the money to start my own marketing consultancy, specializing in helping small businesses build their online presence. Without the constant stress and sabotage I'd been dealing with at home, my work quality had improved dramatically, and I was attracting clients faster than I could handle them. For the first time in years, I was building something that belonged entirely to me. Elena Rodriguez had become more than just my lawyer, she'd become a genuine friend and mentor. We met for coffee every few weeks, and she'd become my guide for navigating legal and financial decisions as an independent business owner. Through Elena, I'd also maintained my friendship with Helen Torres, whose experience with Linda's scam had been so crucial to building my case. Trevor Hughes and I had stayed in touch after the house sale, and what had started as professional correspondence had gradually evolved into something more personal. He understood the importance of financial independence and respected the boundaries I needed to maintain as I rebuilt my life. Our relationship was developing slowly and naturally, based on mutual respect rather than need or convenience. My father had tried to contact me numerous times over the past 6 months, sending letters and leaving voicemails that ranged from apologies to attempts at justification for his behavior. I'd read or listened to each one, but I hadn't responded to any of them. Elena had advised me that maintaining some distance was probably wise, both for legal reasons and for my own emotional well-being. The most recent letter had arrived just last week, and unlike the others, this one didn't ask for forgiveness or try to explain his actions. Instead, it was simply an acknowledgement of what he'd lost and an expression of pride in what I'd accomplished despite his betrayal. "Sam," he'd written, "I know I have no right to ask for anything from you, and I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I've been following your business success, and I'm proud of what you've built for yourself. You've shown strength and intelligence that I never appreciated when I had the chance. I hope someday you find the peace and happiness you deserve." Reading that letter had been harder than dealing with any of his attempts to justify his behavior, because it forced me to confront the complicated reality that I could still love someone who had hurt me so deeply. But it also confirmed that I'd made the right choice in walking away. Some relationships simply couldn't survive certain kinds of betrayal, no matter how much history they contained. Helen Torres and I had started a small support network for families dealing with elder fraud and financial exploitation. We met monthly with other people who'd experienced similar situations, sharing resources and strategies for both prevention and recovery. It was gratifying work that gave meaning to the painful experience I'd survived. "The thing about betrayal," Helen had said during our last group meeting, "is that it teaches you to trust your own instincts. Once you've learned to recognize manipulation and deception, you become much harder to fool. That's a valuable skill that serves you well in all areas of life." She was right. The hypervigilance I developed during those months of being gaslighted and manipulated had made me much more aware of people's motivations and much better at identifying when someone was trying to take advantage of me. It was a painful way to learn those lessons, but the knowledge had already proven invaluable in my business dealings and personal relationships. As I sat in my apartment that evening, I thought about the question that had been bothering me for months, whether I was angry or grateful for what had happened. The betrayal had been devastating, but it had also forced me to discover strength and independence I hadn't known I possessed. I'd learned that I could survive the loss of everything I'd thought was secure, and I could build something better from the wreckage. I realized that I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't grateful either. I was simply at peace with the choices I'd made and the life I was building. The family I'd been born into had taught me painful lessons about trust and betrayal, but I was creating a new kind of family based on mutual respect and genuine care. The most important lesson I'd learned was that love without respect isn't really love at all. My father had claimed to love me while planning to destroy my life, and David had used the language of brotherly concern while actively working to steal my inheritance. Linda had exploited our family's grief and vulnerability, treating our pain as an opportunity for personal gain. But Elena's fierce advocacy for my rights, Helen's generous sharing of her experience and wisdom, and Trevor's patient understanding of my need for independence had shown me what authentic care actually looked like. These people had chosen to support me without expecting anything in return, and they had respected my autonomy even when they disagreed with my decisions. So let me ask you something as I wrap up my story. Have you ever had to choose between what's familiar and what's healthy? Have you experienced betrayal from people who claim to love you? I'd love to hear about your own experiences in the comments below. Sometimes sharing our stories helps other people feel less alone in their struggles. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about family drama, financial independence, and finding the courage to start over when everything falls apart. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it reminds you that you're stronger than you think and that you deserve relationships built on respect and genuine care. Sometimes the best thing we can do for ourselves is walk away from people who treat us poorly, even when those people are family. Trust yourself, protect your boundaries, and never let anyone convince you that you're asking for too much when you demand to be treated with basic human decency.